perhaps get going with our event. So my name is John Conley. I'm the director of the Institute for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies at UC Berkeley, and we're delighted to have with us today Gábor Egry from Budapest. I'll say a few words of introduction, and then Gábor will speak to us. Gábor, as I'm sure you all know, is a historian. He's a doctor of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences and Director General of the Institute of Political History in Budapest. His research interests include nationalism, everyday ethnicity, politics of identity, politics of memory in modern East Central Europe. He's the author of 5 volumes in Hungarian and several articles in European reviews of history, Slavic Review, and the Hungarian Historical Review. His last monograph, I'm going to give it to you in English, but it appeared in Hungarian, Ethnicity, Identity, Politics, Hungarian Minorities, Between Nationalism and Regionalism in Romania and Czechoslovakia, 1918 to 1944, which appeared in Budapest in 2015, was shortlisted for the Felczak-Vereshczycki Prize of the Polish Historical Association. He's been Fulbright Visiting Research Scholar at Stanford, recipient of fellowships from, among others, the Imre Kertész Kolleg in Jena, the New York College, Bucharest, and the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. Since 2018, he's been the principal investigator of the ERC Consolidator Project, NEPO-Strans, negotiating post-imperial transitions from remobilization to nation-state consolidation, a comparative study of local and regional transitions in post-Habsburg East and Central Europe. And today he's going to speak to us on the challenges of history and the temptations of autocracy, history, memory, and politics in Hungary. So with no further ado, Gábor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation, for the possibility to speak of some kind of issues that are fascinating for me for 2 reasons, because I experienced it firsthand, and also because I think that they tell something about where history as an academic discipline is heading today, but in a process that started much longer ago. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm trying to share it. Please be patient, it's always complicated. So I hope you can see it. So it would be quite simple to talk of this topic, just relating concrete events, what happened in Hungary since 2010, when the Fidesz came to power again with a supermajority that enabled the government to reconfigure the constitutional system and the power structures in Hungary. And I will start with saying a few words about my own position. It's inevitable, and it's also, I think, fair to start with it, just to make clear what could be my personal bias, if you will. But nevertheless, I don't think that that kind of institutional reconfiguration and all of those rather contemporary sociological issues that one can even infer into the operation of these new institutions and the disappearance of older institutions of historiography in Hungary are as interesting and as fascinating as the issues I will talk about, namely how deeper developments in historiography and in social memory embed this very concrete political attempt of establishing a new institutional frame for a very active politics of memory in Hungary. So, okay, this is always the issue. I'm sorry. Maybe this way. Yes. So my position is in this talk is quite simple. I'm working in the Institute of Political History, which is a small independent research institute, but which has a baggage, so to say. This was built on the legacy and the heritage of the former Institute for the History of the Party. Nevertheless, it later became a respected Institute of Historical Research in Hungary. Since 2010, budget subsidies from the government that were regular before were cut. 2 years later, a significant part of our archives were nationalized by the government, but with a legal trick that enabled them to refuse paying compensation. And recently, we were evicted on dubious legal grounds, but again, it's not the issue I intend to talk about here. We still have a litigation because the government refuses to pay the cost of preserving the state property in the archives, the nationalized documents. Most of them are still in our storerooms, and we experienced some smear campaigns in the recent years. So I do think that the Institute of Political History is a successful institution with proven excellence, and its archives store documents of great historical value. The fate that the government intends to mete out to this institute is gradual disappearance. And this is practically very much part of the story of the last 10, 11 years, that once respected institutions has disappeared or were sidelined. Nevertheless, in this talk, as I mentioned earlier, although I will tackle some institutional issues, I try to address problems that I consider much more profound, namely the relationship between history and memory in contemporary Hungary and in Hungary since the change of regime, and how this relationship both furthers and simultaneously hampers authoritarian politics of memory, but also obviously almost any kind of politics of memory. While I will not speak too much of the authoritarian politics of memory as an individual topic, I do think that it's important to note that it is not just politics of memory. At least I use the term with a meaning that doesn't simply denote politics of memory that is nationalist or nation-centered or hails past authoritarian projects. Instead, its aim is to creating a vision of history that replicates an authoritarian vision of community, projects it back in history in time, but also replicates the features of this authoritarian community in the way it envisions history itself, a uniform, homogeneous one, centered around the idea of destiny, which is a perspective that almost automatically and inevitably posits a great historical actor, leader, whose capability to sense destiny places him automatically at the head of the community and demands some kind of cooperation from everyone with the lead. And one last caveat before turning to the most profound issues. While certain institutional changes, and especially the management structure, reflects the authoritarian type of rule that is typical today in Hungary. In a sense, this is not unique to Hungary. It can be found even in democratic states, but in those cases, it is more often kind of informality, which is present in within the structures of academia, and usually it is not politics that determines, for example, personal decisions, but that kind of informality and informal relations, which is not necessarily the case in Hungary. But nevertheless, I think it's again important to note that the Hungarian story is not an exceptional story. It is just a story that gives a good insight into what is going on and what was going on within historiography and history as an academic discipline. So the story, as I mentioned, starts at least in this talk, with the change of regime. And I argue that two very important development processes characterized the last 31 years. Reconfiguration of memory in terms of research subjects and norms, which influenced mutually historiography and history as an academic discipline, and also within history, much less visible for the public, growing unease with the epistemological foundations and the explanatory potential of history that manifests itself in phenomena like fear from the so-called postmodern historiography, or seeking legitimacy for the traditional genres in the face of supposed challenges from new ones or new approaches like microhistory, cultural history, and so on. And these processes were parallel. I will try to highlight a few issues where they definitely became interlinked. I will start with the challenges. And the first group of challenges came more from memory to historiography. The first I will mention is non-national memory, which in the post-communist Europe was the most manifest in the form of the appearance of the idea of an European memory. This European memory was supposed to strengthen identification of Europeans with the European project, with the EU, as opposed to the simply being linked with the nation states emotionally through national historical construct. But this European memory was built on the foundations of one very important event, the Holocaust, which also meant that this history get a kind of normative status with significant ethical implications. And within the accession process, within the post-communist countries appeared a tendency and to find a place to the communist history of the communist period of these states in relation to the Holocaust, to a certain extent put on par with the Holocaust within this construct of memory. The Holocaust, again, it's very widely known, is important within this construct of European memory as something that should not happen again, something that is to be avoided. And in this sense, the lesson of the memory of the Holocaust is most importantly kind of educating the citizens of Europe or the people of Europe about this event to avoid its occurrence again. So putting communism on par with it also implied that communism, which was right after the change of regime, obviously seen as something of an antithesis of the new democratic state, gained similar features within the memory, not necessarily within historiography. And to both subjects, connected to both subjects, history gained normative implications and ethical implications as well. Its function started to be not just analyzing these events, not just reconstructing motives or similar, more analytical perception of the Holocaust and the communism, but also to somehow manifest the ethical issues connected with Holocaust and connected with communist oppression. Therefore, victimhood and trauma became key categories of history as well, and not just memory. But it also created further problems with memory and also with history. Here I will only mention the the issue of trauma, because it is also very salient in Hungarian memory. And one of the significant problems with trauma is that it is not so easy, not easy to extend the idea of trauma from individuals to a group to make it a uniform characteristic of a whole group, especially if this supposed trauma is not connected with events like the Holocaust. And in terms of historiographic problems, methodological problems of history or theoretical issues connected with history, it is also a problem of the history as an experience, how historians can integrate that kind of individual experience into their histories, or how they could make of individual stories some kind of history, when actually historians used to consider these individual stories problematic in epistemological terms. We all know the issues with oral histories, self-fashioning, the problematic nature of memoirs, retrospective stories of one's autobiography, and so on. While, and this is a challenge for history as well, it is still very important for history to have a kind of narrative. So, and stories almost automatically provide a narrative, while historians have to struggle with these individual stories, how they could weave into coherent narratives individual stories. So this is, so to say, the first challenge in a long row of challenges. The second one, obviously connected to the previous ones, is the unit of analysis and the unit of reference. Generating a European memory also means somehow generating a European history, which is a different unit of reference and unit of analysis than the national history. And while the national history has its advantage of being familiar and almost seem natural in Europe, European history has to find the subjects that seem to connect or could connect the European nation states and create a European history that is more than just parallel histories of the nation states. And more recently, there is also a challenge for the European history, because if you, for example, look or visit the House of European History in Brussels, the experience is that, or the solution for all the challenges is somehow a story of Europe as a continent of emancipation, cultural and political emancipation and progress, that more recently it is also criticized from a post-colonial perspective, with the argument that actually it just replicates previous conceptions of European white civilizational supremacy. While the European history is above the traditional national one, challenges come also from below, so to say, and both from family, both from memory, from the direction of memory, and also from the direction of certain new genres of history, historiography. Family memory again raises the issue of how individual experiences can be molded into history, and again the issue of trauma and victimhood, because in this post-1918 setting, it was quite typical to look for family memories of traumatic events, family memories of suffering, family memories of violence, family memories of victimhood. And even though sometimes it seems very democratic, so open to everyone to reveal that kind of family memories, individual memories. There is always a selection process, which is not rarely biased towards only putting on display those memories that conform with the initial framing of the memory as the memory of some kind of common suffering. But if we are looking below the national level, it is also important to note that there is a tendency in Hungary. It is also fairly visible among history teachers of elite secondary schools, gymnasiums, which promotes the idea that we should shift the focus of history education, and with history education also implicitly memory, social memory, to the history of the common people. And the argument is usually that pupils nowadays could better find themselves in these kind of stories than in the traditional stories of political history, great historical actors, heroes, whatever. Both for history and memory, so practitioners of memory, and for historians, it is a challenge also how we can relate these levels to each other to somehow make all of them meaningful, or which one we should neglect, like in the case of the history of the common people, which would produce a history that is much closer to what is reflected in the House of the European History in Brussels, kind of cultural history of people, the nations, continent. Again, I've already spoke of story and history and their tension, the tension between these concepts. But it's, again, a very visible tendency in Hungary, but elsewhere as well, that the public audience is much more open to histories that also reveal stories, or that has a clear narrative and story-like narrative. And while for historians, it is a challenge to make story out of histories of different scales. I think that many of us know how hard it is to write a history from scattered individual cases, even if it manifests the same historical phenomena within Hungary or within East Central Europe. If historians, or some historians, think that if they want to preserve influence on public memory, on the historical consciousness of the public, they also have to conform with that kind of demand and expectation. So just to give an example, I put on this slide the cover pages of 3 recent books written by Ignác Romšič, who is probably the best known or the most acknowledged Hungarian historian, basically a historian of 20th century Hungary. And you can see that the oldest one is on the right side, which is about how we lost Transylvania. And while it is not strictly speaking a story of an individual, so classic story, it still situates history within a very basic story of Hungarian suffering and loss at the end of the First World War, and lasting until the end of the Second World War. And it's a very, it has a very typical geographic focus as well. If Hungarians are speaking of the consequences in Trianon, it's more typical to refer to Transylvania as a lost territory than to the southern regions, or to present-day Slovakia, what is usually called in Hungary today Felvidék. In the middle, there is a book about Hungarian rebels, and it is about short portraits of rebellious Hungarians, some of them very well established figures in Hungarian history for more than a century. Again, this is important to see that even for Ignác Romšič to make an impact on the public and the public perception of history seems to be important to write that kind of short, individualized biographic stories, which doesn't really give a coherent picture of a phenomenon, even though the title implies some kind of commonality. And the third one is, again, 6 portraits of 20th century European politicians who once were seen as saviors of their country and later as personalities who contributed to the destruction of the country. Again, biography, again, a topic that is relatively far from Romšič's original and most significant field of interest and research. So it's, I think, a telling example of what kind of challenges historians face when they want to reach out to the public. The next one I briefly want to talk about is the relationship between history and identity, be it national, be it political, be it a kind of combination of political and national. Again, already the idea of a European memory was connected with the generating of a European identification, a European identity, and it is not atypical. It's a classic function of history and historiography in modern Europe. Nevertheless, there's a more interesting issue in Hungary, or there was a more interesting issue in Hungary. It lasted until 2010, when the concepts of history applied actually reflected the concepts of the polity that were represented by those political organizations or those political camps in Hungary. So on the left and for the liberals, the Republican features of Hungary were the most important, and they wanted to base politics on a kind of civic engagement. And connected to this idea, they promoted the idea of a history that is the history of the state, so its citizens, and a history that is reflexive, expects the citizens to think about what history means for them, and also multifaceted, multivocal, in which several interpretations could find their place. And it was opposed to the concept of history on the right in Hungary, which postulated that the history of 20th century Hungary should be the history of the Hungarians. That means that it could not have been the history of the citizens only, because significant part of the Hungarians weren't Hungarian citizens and didn't live and still don't live within the boundaries of the country. And the only way to create a kind of common history, a commonality that was supposed to characteristic for everyone, every Hungarian, was to conceptualize this history as a common suffering since the dissolution of Hungary at the end of the First World War. And it also meant that within this uniform community, people had to focus or supposed to focus since the end of the First World War on somehow regaining what was lost, recreating a polity that was more than just community of suffering. Nevertheless, especially in this second variety, the community was reduced to suffering and victimhood, making the idea of trauma again very significant and important, and raising again the issue how one can connect individually to that kind of history, how one can bring forth an individual story, a family memory that was not traumatic and not written or not remembered in terms of victimhood. After challenges coming more from side of memory, I noted a few challenges that I think are coming more from within historiography as the academic discipline. Nevertheless, they all have some kind of significance for political and connections with politics of memory as well. I've already mentioned the epistemological skepsis regarding history, regarding how much we can actually reveal facts and truths from the past. And whatever we think of it, it is actually an opening for politics, or could be an opening for politics, because it's easy to argue that if historians themselves are not sure of the truth, the historical truth, then why not to promote alternatives? Why not to posit alternative interpretations in a position of authority, even with the help of politics? It is connected to the difference between myth and history. That was also a favorite topic of Hungarian historians, although more in the 90s than later. But it very neatly resurfaced just a few weeks ago when the new director of the National Museum, László L. Simon, who is a poet and politician, gave an introductory speech to all the employees. And in this speech, he mentioned that while he will not demand from historians to justify myths with historical methodology, but nevertheless, he stated that some of these myths are significant building elements of Hungarian national identity, and therefore it is also not the task of historians to publicly question them. They should leave them as they are. So while in the 90s, the conclusion of historians, among them also Romšič, was that historians does not have anything to do with myths, because this is a different genre and it has a different function. No, to a certain extent, one can even say that politics come back with a vengeance and bans historians from criticizing myths, even pointing out that myth is not history. And another important internal characteristic of historiography is, I think, the cycles of revision, which is natural, and to a certain extent, it is also the result of our subjective, let's call it, vanity. Some historians are not content with peddling the same issues that other historians have already discovered, and they want to change, they want to tell a different story. And if we are speaking of cycles of revision, for this talk, I distinguished two varieties. One, what I think comes more from within the existing paradigm. I noted here Emily Grabel's most recent book, which is trying to posit Muslims of Europe within European modernity instead of relegating them at the edge of the continent in a backward position. And I do think that it still preserves a very basic structure of the original paradigm, so to say, because it considers modernity as the most important, or a very important element of European history. And giving a Hungarian example here, a few years ago, Béla Tomka, a Hungarian economic historian, wrote an article on the Hungarian economy after the First World War, and he argued based on statistical data and statistical indices that actually it was not the economic catastrophe that is usually implied or attested to in historiography and in public memory too, because Hungary preserved the industrial base. Hungary had a better renewal capacity in terms of switching to new industries in the late 20s and early 30s than most of its neighbors, and therefore he questioned an important element of the story of suffering and catastrophe after the First World War, but nevertheless he did not question the basic assumption of this history, that somehow it was still a very serious event what happened, a very serious development what happened to Hungary at the end of and to Hungarians at the end of the First World War. Instead, they just put the emphasis differently. And there is a revisionism which is more shifting the paradigm. One can mention Sheila Fitzpatrick and her criticism of the totalitarian paradigm, or the national indifference literature regarding the history of the Habsburg Empire and nationalism, nationhood in modern East Central Europe. And in this case, it is also present in Hungary as well. But nevertheless, while it is probably easier to make politics accept the first type of revision, although it's not necessarily happening. Tomka was heavily criticized, so it's still not part of a canonic understanding of the history. This kind of revisionism in Hungary betrays that somehow politics is reluctant to accept that kind of revisionism, even in cases when it could benefit from it. So, for example, it is possible to conclude from a different approach to the history of interwar Hungarian minorities that their existence was not as traumatic as it is usually assumed. Most of them could continue their lives relatively undisturbed, and the main characteristic of their existence, at least up to the late 30s, was not oppression or suffering, but they could find a kind of modus vivendi in the new successor states. And if one extend this argument, and there is ground to do it for the period before the First World War, this argument has a potential to actually change how we see the Hungarian nationality politics, which would alleviate some of the responsibility from the Hungarian elites that is usually attested to them for the collapse of Hungary. And the Hungarian politics is reluctant to do this kind of shift, not because they do not want to see this kind of responsibility alleviated, but because it would also mean abandoning the idea of common traumatic suffering since the end of the First World War. And this way, they also prove that for the politics of memory, the end of the First World War, the Trianon Treaty, is probably the most important event and building element in present-day Hungary. So just very briefly about the last of the challenges, people. So all kind of surveys about the historical knowledge and consciousness of Hungarian society demonstrate that even despite the presence of these important elements of politics of memory in school textbook, even despite of the weight of and presence of canonical historiography in popularizing books, people's consciousness is not automatically shaped and determined by it. It is not so easy to mold and the individual and collective historical consciousness. Attitudes to Trianon are very paradoxical, so to say. People are not accepting the normative implications of the history. They are and they don't know the basic facts of the peace treaty, but also they don't know the basic facts of the present of the Hungarian minorities. And this is true for the Kádár era as well. That's quite interesting to see that among the younger generations, the Kádár era is also seen with a kind of nostalgia, although they do not have that kind of experience that usually associated with nostalgia in the older generations. So the result is uncertainty, flexibility, loss of authority, necessity to find new forms of engagement for the Hungarians, and the question, how is it possible to build or create a historical consciousness that is also more democratic? Could history be turned into a democratic experiment with civic engagement, education, reflexivity associated with democracy? After challenges, I arrived at the temptations. Why present-day politics of history, politics of memory, politics of history, and its practices are tempting for many of the historians? The more abstract answer is, I think, because it provides something that was lost or that was shaken in the last 30 years. Namely, it has clear goals. It admits that history is important for the formation of a political and the national identity, and to a certain extent, it even restores a kind of traditional historical culture. So it offers sense of stability for historians and a sense of stability for certain parts of the population, certain parts of society as well. Oh, I'm sorry, it doesn't work again. Yes. The second reason, I think, is the new resources. So since 2010, large amount of money and funds were directed into historical research, mainly through new institutions, which also meant new positions for a select few and new symbolic capital. Nowadays, if a historian receives state dedication, it is usually a historian very close to the governing party. So individually, for a few, it is actually a career path and the elevation of their status within society, not necessarily within academia, but that's, I think, in this case, a different story. The most important new institutions were Veritas, the Institute for the History of the Change of Regime, Clio Institute, which is run by a few very young scholars who, through personal connections, could get a significant amount of money to establish a research institute, even before they had their PhD. The most recent one is the Magyarságkutató, and this is the most scandalous probably, where relatively solid archaeological research coexists with para-historians who want to prove the Hungarian Hun descent and similar historical myths. If one looks at the opening pages of their websites, one can identify the most some important subjects they are dealing with, like Trianon, the Horthy era, and the consolidation. There is István Bethlen, or statue of István Bethlen's in the middle on the change of regime. And one can also probably sense how they treat these topics. Nevertheless, both the internal relations within these new institutions and also the relations between these new institutions are complicated. It would be unfair to say that only amateurs or para-historians work in these institutions. One must admit that in all of these institutions, one can find serious historians, in some even recognized historians, historians who are recognized as being the foremost experts of certain topics, like, for example, Robert Herman in the Veritas Institute, who is an expert of the Hungarian Revolution and War of Liberation 1848. But they also had problems and have problems with recruitments, manifesting some kind of rejection from the broader academia. And that's quite important for the authoritarian nature of this institution making. Most of these institutions were established not on the basis of some kind of conscious central agenda of politics of memory, but rather along patrimonial prebendal relations. So practically, some people asked Prime Minister of donation of a historical research institute for themselves or for someone else, and that's the reason why they are also rivals in political sense as well with each other. On the other hand, and that was much more coherent and part of the agenda, there is the sidelining or even elimination of dissent. In institutional terms, as I mentioned, the Institute of Political History is the last independent historical research institute in the country, with the CEU, with the 1956 Institute either leaving the country or having been left the country or being dissolved. But integration is an option within either these new institutions or into the academia, former academia institutes and the universities for those who worked in these eliminated institutions, if they do not demonstrate public dissent. Nevertheless, while up to 2018, most historians considered that the Research Institute of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences and also some of the larger universities will be safe havens with the detaching of the research institutes from the academia. This sense of security was also shaken, but still a wide range of institutions, university departments are certainly not agents of government politics of memory. Rather, they are, so to say, refuge for historians who oppose either the government or oppose its politics of memory and the historiographic agenda of these government-sponsored research institutions. So, what's the consequence of all these processes for what we see today in Hungary? And with today, I mean really the last year and this year, the 300th anniversary and the COVID pandemics, the period of the COVID pandemics, politics of memory, government politics of memory. While this politics of memory offers seemingly a restoration of the classic role of history as a presentist explanation of what's going on today, in a way of practically linking the past with the present, not necessarily just in causal terms, but really generating the sense that the past is the same as the present. And also it offers restore the forecasting potential of history. So being able to forecast what will come on the basis of historical narrative. A closer look reveals a rather postmodern twist within this whole construct. The most manifest it is in the symbolic space in Budapest, where restoration of historic buildings is very often supported by arguments of the necessity to restore some kind of historicity, the authentic historical space. But on the other hand, in the very same area, on the Castle Hill, where buildings are reconstructed, the Prime Minister's office is located in a former monastery, on which a balcony was, or to which a balcony was attached, just because the Prime Minister wanted a panoramic view of the Danube, what he can show to his guests. And actually, if you follow the Prime Minister's Facebook page, you will see that all of his guests is guided to this balcony. And it's also quite interesting to see how within these seemingly restorative politics of memory, important concepts of this more traditional historical culture just simply dissolve or lose their meanings, like the concept of an historical era, historical age. Now, if you listen to the politicians, and Mr. Orban is very much in making historical arguments or using history for arguing, you will hear that Hungary passes practically in every 5 years to a new world era, historical period. So just a few days ago, I have learned from our foreign minister that we are the winners of the new era of world economic history. So in a sense, it generates a paradox. According to this construct, we are living parallelly in a permanent apocalypse and permanent resurrection. And conservatism or conservation of something that is seemed or considered to be the authentic form of existence is linked with extreme progressism. That's how we must win the new era of world history, world economics must fit to this new era of world economics just to preserve a society that is supposed to preserve the values of the early 20th century. And there are other signs of this patchwork of memory within symbolic politics as well. The most significant or the most fascinating probably among them is how last year and this year as well, government politics of memory tried to reconceptualize the Trianon Treaty as a Central European trauma of all Central European nations, with the argument that it was a conscious attempt of the Western power to colonize the whole region, not just Hungary. Obviously, one of the motives to develop this kind of concept was the ongoing struggle over the colonial past and the post-colonial criticism of European and United States politics of memory symbolic space. But this concept is again laden with a very deep contradiction, namely that parallelly with this idea of common trauma, the politics of memory and the politics declares that the era of suffering is over because Hungary is again the strongest nation within the Carpathian Basin, and it is again capable to fulfill its historical mission, its historical destiny, to organize the Carpathian Basin. And this is a tenet of classic Hungarian nationalism and interwar irredentism. So it's hard to see how it is. It will be reconciled with the idea of a common Central European trauma, not to speak of the fact that the Carpathian Basin is not Central Europe, but in this construct, the Carpathian Basin becomes Central Europe and not, so somehow shrinking it to the authentic Hungarian space. Nevertheless, and this is kind of conclusion, if we think about what will be the result, what could be the result of this rather conscious attempt of creating a memory or generating a memory that that isn't even really the continuation of conservative or rightist or nationalist legacies within Hungarian history and Hungarian intellectual history. So how much we can expect it to be successful, to reconfigure historical consciousness, social memory. And I do think that that both historical examples from the interwar period, but also the surveys I mentioned from the recent years, shows or gives hope for that, and especially with this kind of somewhat caricaturistic anything goes attitude and postmodernist, so to say, postmodernist attitude, it will be less successful, as even those historians who fear from it think. Somehow, especially because history and memory is disconnected, and the influence of history and the influence of historical education on social memory is not as direct as we used to think or used to hope. I'm a historian, and I really would like to see my work changing the attitudes of the Hungarian society. So exactly for this reason, the government also faces an uphill battle when it wants to change historical attitudes. The most probable outcome, I think, is that not much will change, and the basic indifference towards history will remain, but it will also somehow save society from being turned into more nationalistic than it is today. Unfortunately, if these autocratic attempts fail, not historians will be the main heroes of the resistance. So thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that very profound set of thoughts on our profession. So we have a few questions that have come up. I'll read them aloud. I don't know if you can see them as well, but that will, if I read them, perhaps give you a moment to reflect. So the first question from Gisela, the ideal Hungary seems to be defined as by the state as pre-Trianon, without reparation to the victims of the Holocaust and exclusive of minorities, Roma, LGBTQ, and non-Christian or new immigrants. So my question is whether there is any movement towards a different perspective of Hungary based on diversity and inclusive of Hungary's anti-everything?
Thank you for the question. The answer is yes, but it's less happening in the sphere of official politics of memory and more in the sphere of academia and civic society. So there are very fascinating initiatives, attempts. There is an institutional framework for example, for the memory of Jews. There are attempts to establish something similar to the Roma. With the partial victory of the opposition in the local governments, there are also some local governments which support initiatives concerning the Roma, for example. And probably the most problematic will be in the short term the issue of the LGBT community, because it is no subject of political campaign and also legislation that is aimed at making them practically invisible. And therefore, it is really a significant issue how much historians, and again, it is worth to note that the government banned gender studies from the university curriculum. So, so how much historians will risk to try to make these groups more visible and included into a different history. And there is also an issue that while pertaining more to politics of memory and not to historiography, while the government has this very, at least on the surface, coherent concept of how Hungarian history should look like and how it should be manifested on the streets and in the textbook, there is no alternative yet. So there is no political project of some kind of new memory that is more inclusive. There is no narrative, there is no history that would include in this sense. There is the already the thought that we should somehow do it, because it is also, it could also reflect not just the diversity, but reflect this more democratic society. And this is practically analogous to what happens in the United States or in the United Kingdom regarding blacks, regarding slaves, but there is no conscious attempt and there is no coherent concept yet.
Thank you. So this is from Dominique Ryle. Thank you for your courageous talk. You know how much I appreciate all you do. A question. I'm wondering how much you think the government's ability to squash independent historical inquiry is also linked to a growing alienation between what a general public willingly reads and what problematizing professional historians write. Or, to put it another way, is one of the other temptations of current authoritarian control of the historical narrative fueled by the situation that a general public doesn't really care what new historical research does, and therefore squashing without dissent is easier?
Thanks, Dominic, for the question. It's great that you formulated a conclusion for my talk. I missed. I definitely agree that this is a very significant part of the problem. And I try to highlight it, not as successfully as I wished, that the demand for history is actually more a demand for what historians would rather consider stories. And on the one hand, it's very hard to find the way, and I think that Ignác Romšić's attempts exemplify it very well, how historians are struggling with this problem. So a way that would make our history, the history we are writing, more attractive, and also to find the topics which we could somehow infuse with those important conclusions that are different from what is known in the canonical historical consciousness, so to say. I would be happy to offer solutions for the problem. What I see is, however, that revisionism sometimes in itself could be interesting. So in the case of Tomka, you could find people who became interested. My personal experience with this Tomka thesis is actually quite funny. I was giving a talk in Stuttgart with a Romanian colleague, Bogdan Murgescu, to Hungary, mostly to Hungarian audience, and there
Gábor, we lost you for a while.
Yes, but I'm back. So I was talking of this experience of mine in Stuttgart. So it is, but I wouldn't say that it was the perfect solution for the problem. They definitely noted something that was new for them and contradicted, let's call it, the older beliefs. So revisionism could work, and there is also important that in this sense, Hungary is also a divided society or fragmented society. So there is an audience for that kind of new history. It's hard to connect with them, especially within this institutional setting, where the public sphere and is very much dominated by the government.
We have a question. Let's see if I could. What is the role of the church in the reimagining of the past?
The most significant, but it's not exclusively, is the growing importance of the denominational schools in the educational system. So in the last more than 10 years, the government very consciously handed over state schools to the churches, and the churches are more freer to arrange the education, even the content of the education. So one can say that, again, a paradox of the story, that one can say that up to the 2015-16, probably the churches were a kind of more conservative element in this context or within this whole system. But since the extreme centralization of the state schools and significant changes in the content of history education, the historical textbooks, including the insertion of the parahistory like the Hun-Hungarian descent, no, some of the church schools are islands of a more liberal, more progressive, or just more balanced history education, for example. So again, we are running into these paradoxes that something that seems to be quite simple could yield very different results.
I love this word, parahistory, not used often enough in our own context. There's a question now from George Lazar. He writes, in the 20s and 30s, the Trina cult never gained significant credibility and popularity among Hungarian Americans and Canadians. In fact, only some far-right Hungarian emigres groups supported it. Few of these groups were even connected to the silver shirts fascist movement here in the US. Why was that? Why was historical memory so different at that time among Hungarians in North America? And he writes further down, of course, I refer to Hungarian immigrants arriving in North America after World War I.
Thank you for the question. I'm not an expert of the immigration, but I may offer an explanation that is rather based on an unexpected similarity between the immigrant communities or diaspora communities, probably it's better, and the interwar Hungarian society. Because if you look at how much the irredentist propaganda resonated with Hungarian society in Hungary in the interwar period, there are signs that it was less profound than we used to assume. So minority Hungarians who visited Hungary in the 30s regularly complained about how they were treated by Hungarians, how much they were not offered the solidarity they expected. They were regularly asked how they could speak so well Hungarian if they were from Romania or Czechoslovakia. There were signs of welfare chauvinism or fear from minority Hungarians taking the jobs of Hungarians from Hungary. And if we consider how prevalent the irredentist propaganda in the everyday life of Hungarians in that period was, that allows for the conclusion that it was less effective than we think, and probably the Hungarian society was less infused by these ideas, at least up to the mid-30s or late 30s as well. So probably the Hungarian diasporas rather reflect the reality of interwar Hungary and not what we assume based on sources that are biased towards an official representation of interwar Hungary that was keen to portray Hungarian society as unified behind irredentism.
Next question asks about Hungary as a Christian society. The current political portrayal of Hungary as a profoundly Christian society rings true historically. Does it ring true historically or even currently?
I think one can argue that up to the Second World War, early post-Second World War period, religiosity and especially in this case Christianity played a significant role within Hungarian society, even though there is also the case of the political instrumentalization and ideologization of Christianity as non-Jewish, but nevertheless the practices were alive. But today's Hungary is not a profoundly Christian society. Today's Hungary is probably the second or third most secularized in Europe. At least if we consider religiosity in the sense of adherence to the church doctrine and regular participation in religious activities within the church. If we define religiosity this way, then Hungarian society, then 10–11% of the Hungarian society is religious, and there is a large 40–50% who consider themselves religious, but they are more keen to engage in those activities that still has some kind of social function and meaning beyond the church as well, like marriage or baptism.
Good. Next question is from Leslie Waters. Thank you for your presentation. I was wondering if you could speak to the ways in which the Hungarian government instrumentalizes Western cosmopolitan commentaries on Hungarian history, especially the sorts of articles that appear in major media outlets that are sometimes not terribly well researched.
Yes, the basic strategy is less historical, or I would say indirectly historical. So they do not really engage in historical arguments, but they gladly point out historical inaccuracies as a proof for the indifference or the absence of knowledge, and in a generalized way, not just an absence of knowledge regarding the specific author, but regarding the West or the cosmopolitan West or the liberals. So they use these very broad labels in this case. But in these cases, they do not really use it. But you can find the instrumentalization of this kind of commentary in more programmatic texts of politics of memory, juxtaposed with characteristics of Hungarianness as well. And these texts are usually embedded into a kind of historicized argumentation, positing present-day Hungary as a continuation of some kind of historical traditions that in Hungary still exist, but they are disappearing in the West. And one of the reasons of the negligence or indifference of the West is this kind of loss of their own foundations.
Next question comes from Amanda Brown. Can you speak to how historians' contributions to museum exhibits and interpretations mitigate these nationalist narratives and what barriers they face to making those contributions?
Most of the museums in Hungary incorporate historians and museologists. Moreover, many of the museologists working in museums used to have historical degrees as well, MA or even doctoral degrees. So, so it is usually brought together already within the museum and before an exhibition is planned, curated, devised. The problem is that, for example, I don't want to generalize, but tendentially one can find more, let's call them traditionally minded museologists, historians in museums in the countryside, smaller museums, while the central museums are now occupied by the politics. And even a few years ago, there was a very visible political influence, for example, on the exhibitions of the National Museum. So there was a kind of trade-off that they organized an exhibition that was ordered by the politics, by the government, but they still could independently manage their own permanent exhibitions or own temporary exhibitions as well. I don't know what will happen with the new leadership of the museum. But there are specialized collections, museums, and or museums like the Museum of Ethnography, which offers a really refreshing and progressive view on history as well. So there are collections where it is present. The problem is that museums are also struggling with reaching the public. and very often how they reach a larger public is with the help of these politically ordered temporary exhibitions to which the politics generates a kind of audience. And there is the rather infamous House of Terror, which is very popular among tourists as well, and very impressive, but that is heavily criticized by historians and museologists because of the biased and inaccurate and tendentious and ideological representation of 20th century Hungarian history.
Yeah, I visited that museum with my then 16-year-old daughter last year, and she quite simply found it boring because it became too predictable after a while. Next question is from Andrew Berendt. What do you think it will take for Trianon to lose its grip on Hungarian memory? I always find it difficult to imagine that the average Hungarian could possibly find it to be traumatic. Virtually no one now alive could have experienced it. And its staying power seems to be somehow artificially maintained.
Thanks, Andrew. I wholeheartedly agree. So this is an issue of how individual trauma is extended and used to generate a collective one, which is supposedly uniform, but which is not supported by any or most individual experiences. So the answer is relatively easy, I think. It would take a different approach from politics, because right now it is politics that keeps this kind of trauma. It is an entirely cultural one, and one of the most extremes, I think. There is no real experience behind it, at least no real traumatic experience. So it's more about negotiating kind of cultural or traumatic understanding of history. And therefore, I think that it's relatively simple in the sense that as soon as we would change this interpretation and we would replace the practices that recreate the traumatic sense, we could relatively easily get rid of it and treat the remaining problems as they are, like rights of Hungarian minorities, practical discrimination, legal inequality or asymmetry, and so on. These are quite significant. So I hope that it would be relatively easy to do.
The next question comes from Paul Hannebrink. You described very powerfully the way that the government patronage and attitudes to history have distorted public discussion of history. How would you assess the role of Hungarian historians with long-term or permanent positions in other EU countries? Do their different institutional settings give them different opportunities to intervene in public discussions about history? And he continues, I mean Hungarians who have left Hungary for academic job opportunities in other EU countries.
I fear not. At least my experience with these colleagues is that unless they really intend to keep presence in Hungary, their voice will not hurt too much. So it is today quite different than it was even 30 years ago, or not to speak of 40 years ago, and especially generationally. So Ivan Berendt still used to publish some op-eds in Hungarian newspapers, but the readership is mostly those who used to read Berendt's articles or books 30, 40 years ago. And from the younger generation, there are from the younger generation who very consciously try to keep a presence within Hungary, and it also gives them a platform to contribute to discussion. The problem I see here is that there is not much potential for reception right now for that kind of conversation that would involve not just Hungarian historians, but other Eastern European historians into this kind of public memory activity. So it's a hard nut to crack how we could make them heard better.
Great, thanks very much. Next question comes from Rex Horgan. The Hungarian government is keen to draw attention to the renovation of synagogues in Budapest, support for Jewish community, etc. Can we expect a renaissance of Jewish society in Budapest, or are these largely public relations exercised by the national government?
No, not just public relation exercise. I mean, even if the intention would be, the results are real. And you can see a renaissance or something that is possible to call renaissance. Most interestingly, actually, it's not the renaissance. The most visible is not the renaissance of more traditional Jewish communities, the Neolog ones, but the Lubavitchi Hasidic community. But that's also probably because they are more visible in a sense, but they receive more support from the government. And I also think that the doctrine of Hungarian government is not would be a mistake to confuse with some kind of very traditional anti-Semitism. It's kind of integral nationalism, which postulates that every nation has its place in the world, and if they find this place and the authentic form of existence, and it includes the Jews as well, then there would not be a conflict between nations. So the government is very happy to sponsor Jewish activity if it is Jewish in an ethnic sense. What is more problematic, and they are not so successful in dealing with it, is that kind of Jewish community that is much more conscious than it was before the Holocaust, but still very much assimilated in cultural terms. Because in this case, the delineation of Jews as a nation and Hungarians as a nation is not so easy.
Thank you. So we have a question from Dominique, big question. I don't know if you can answer this one. Are you afraid of speaking out the way you do? How do you find the courage to do this?
No, I'm not. And I could say that although I never really felt fear from speaking out, but I'm also tired of others' fears, so to say. I used to feel and it gives me strength, the recognition of colleagues, even if just as a historian, the friendship of colleagues as well. And I know that you can really appreciate it, that I have 2 cats, so I don't have anything to fear from.
Perhaps I could ask a question which I think involves Hungary, but goes beyond Hungary, which is something intriguing you talked about, which was history, perhaps in service of democracy or in support of democracy. Do you have any can you imagine any general principles of how one would teach this kind of history? I mean, it's interesting. We, in theory, should be interested in this everywhere, but it's not clear, you know, what the guiding principles would be, other than obvious things like, you know, critical inquiry, proper use of sources, and of course, absence of direct government involvement, which goes against the mission of the university anyway, right? But is there anything that you've learned in perhaps working in Hungarian institutions in the last 10 years that might help us more generally to think about how historians can contribute to supportive democracy? Any thoughts?
Yes, but I feel that they are not necessarily theoretically well grounded, more kind of impressions from the last years, the last decade. So I agree that what you said, that there are some principles, but they are, or they sound often banal. What I think could be crucial is kind of making society a bit more aware of the significance of what we call reflexivity in history. So what I would rather try to change is not necessarily the content, what people learn, rather how they think of history. And what I think of could be helpful here is not necessarily textbooks on it, but something that makes them help practicing. So I would think of along the lines of some kind of civic engagement. Recently, I had an idea which I'm trying to test with, usually with colleagues, what they think of it. And this is about street names. Somehow providing people with information, easily accessible information on historical street names connected with history, in a form that doesn't simply tell a story with drawn conclusions, but rather demonstrates the contested nature of these historical figures, historical phenomena, whatever. And I can think of extending that kind of activity. It's laborious, and obviously it's a very long process if you think or think of starting yourself. So, but nevertheless, that could be something that I would hope for to yield these results.
That's great. In other words, involving people in history.
Yeah,
that's democracy. Yeah, very good. Excellent, fabulous. Well, this was wonderful. I think we all greatly benefited from your thoughts and your answers to our questions. I see no more open questions, so I think I'll call the meeting to a conclusion, unless I don't see any further questions. So with that, I wish you a pleasant rest of your evening in Budapest, and thank you all of you who came